So Janet currently works for a small Belgian-based software startup called Soda, and they develop software that queries databases to surface missing, invalid, or unexpected data, the worst sort of data, right? Janet's presentation is going to focus on how she sees an opportunity to uplift an information architecture from product-based to task-based so that users could more readily find direct answers to problems that they had. When Janet finds spare time, she is a passionate cook with a personal recipe collection that spans 30 years. Yeah, right. That's a lot of recipes. She also takes pride in offering her expertise as a mentor to women in tech, which is awesome. And in the before times, she took a break from adulting to travel around the world with her small family and somehow found the time to write a book about that experience. Folks, please join me in welcoming Janet Revell.
Does this work? It's okay? Okay, thanks. Thanks, Jared. Well, good morning, fellow humans. This is my talk. As Jared said, I am a technical writer. I've been working as a tech writer for the past precisely 20 years, actually this year, the last 16 of which have been in the software industry. At present, as Jared said, I'm working for a small startup out of Belgium, and I'm here today to share the details about a project I completed recently to turn product-based docs into task-based content. So what you'll get from me today is a story, really, about audience focus and the worthwhile struggle to change perspective. At Soda, our product team was facing a usability problem, and I proposed that reimagining the documentation could help address that problem. I designed a project with practical steps to implement changes in our docs, and the resulting outcome, as measured by feedback and metrics, gauged the project a success. However, not all of it was as tightly executed as it could have been. Imagine that. And I'll share my notes about the things that went well and what I would do differently if I had the opportunity to do a project like this again. My hope is that if you've been thinking about shifting your perspective of docs to better engage your audience of readers, you might consider taking away what I've learned and tackling a similar project of your own. So allow me to give a little bit of context in the environment in which I executed this project. Soda is very small. It's based out of Belgium. We're about 35 people working remotely in various parts of Europe and North America. I work from my home in Vancouver, Canada, but the rest of my team is in Belgium. The company develops open source and enterprise software that, as Jared said, tests data in databases to surface bad data. For example, you can imagine a case where you have a table full of customer information, name, email, address, that kind of thing. Using Soda software, you can write tests that make sure all those entries, like in the email column, follow the format of an email address. So it's pretty simple, straightforward software, but it is quite new and it's in quite a new space. My role at Soda is as a tech writer. I'm a docs team of one, though as often is the case in a startup, I do a fair bit more than just docs. One thing notably to my advantage is that I host our Soda community in Slack, offering advice and support, and basically acting as an informal community lead in our company. The community's small, it's about 2,400 people, so at this stage, it's interacting with folks is pretty manageable and ultimately pretty informative for me as I develop the documentation for this audience. A brief note here about my authoring environment. To author and publish, I use a relatively simple docs as code setup in which I sort my backlog of tasks in Jira, and then I author in Markdown in Visual Studio Code. I use a public GitHub repo for version control and Jekyll as a static site generator with just the docs theme and a little bit of CSS to publish the content online. Because it's relevant to this project, I'm gonna just explain a little bit about the Soda software and the parts that make up the whole, because it dictates the whole impetus for this project. There's an open source tool, version of the tool that we call Soda Core, that you can use as a Python library or a CLI tool to execute the data quality tests. It uses a proprietary YAML-based language that we call SOTA checks language. Well, that works. That you use to write the tests for data quality. Additionally, we offer a commercial version of the SOTA Core Python library and tool, but with a few more features, and we call that SOTA Library. And you can also deploy that library as a SOTA agent, which is exactly the same as the library, but deployed in a Kubernetes cluster in a customer's cloud services environment. And then finally, we have using with SOTA Library and Agent, we offer a web-based UI called SOTA Cloud that users can access to monitor test results over time. So what this amounts to is the perception. Oops, sorry, I just messed this up here a little bit. What this amounts to is the perception that there are several products, depending on how you categorize SOTA CL. And even though they basically present different ways of interacting with the same technology, it's all pretty much the same. So given this information about the company and the product and the title of this talk, I'm sure you can begin to visualize what the documentation itself looked like. It looked as expected. It was thorough, it was complete, it was up to date, and most of the content was organized by product. But what's so bad about being organized by product? It's why would you bother changing what doesn't appear to be broken? What's the problem here? The problem was not the docs. The truth is, the documentation was not even really a subject of complaint. On the contrary, the docs earned quite a lot of praise from our prospects and customers, from people who were using the material during their evaluation of SOTA products and considering it a positive selling point. The impetus for this project was to shift away from product-based content. It was rooted in a more general complaint. It was too hard to get started with SOTA. Even with the documentation, users had a hard time figuring out where and how to begin using the products. Internally, we referred to this as the cold start problem. So the cold start problem was a product problem, of which documentation is a part. Are the docs good? Yeah. Thorough? Sure. But they weren't meeting our new users' needs. And as a new company with new product suite, most of our customers qualified as new. So reading the documentation, though, users weren't getting what they needed because it didn't answer their most immediate questions or solve their elemental problems. The way it was structured and presented, the doc served the product, not the user. Of course, the documentation wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great just because it didn't have that focus. So as the product team began working with engineering on sorting out the in-product onboarding experience, I proposed a change in documentation that I had been just itching to do for years, which was, and this gave me the perfect opportunity to really execute on it. What if we refactored our documentation from product-based to task-based content? What if we were prescriptive in our setup instructions to squarely address the needs of new users? What if we exposed our users to realistic experience of using various products to solve the very specific problems that they face? What if our content strove to make users productive rather than just document our product features? Probably sounds familiar. With our uncomfortable product siloing and having fielded way too many where do I start questions, my colleagues and most importantly, my company's leadership were ready to experiment with me. I wasn't ready, and I was totally ready to start on this, ready to focus on what new users needed. It's worth mentioning, well, Renee can look away for this part. It's worth mentioning that I was working with just a little bit more than anecdotal evidence for this project. I had Google metrics and I had stats collected from the thumbs up, thumbs down votes at the bottom of every docs page. Correlating those metrics and stats, I was able to discern the most viewed and most disliked pages, which I called the most hated content. When layered over the anecdotal evidence I got, I had of users not knowing how to get started, I could convince myself that there was a thread here, that there was a pattern, that people weren't happy. People hated the content so much because it was people trying to use the reference material to get started, and it really wasn't meeting what they expected it to do. So But that's a thin thread based on the metrics that I had. This is just to say that I didn't have the best stuff going in, but I did have something. My plan was to archive this data and start collecting and analyzing data anew when I launched the whole new set of refactored docs. So I had some data that indicated that there was a problem. I had a hypothesis on how to address the problem, and I had the support of the organization to proceed. So now I just had to turn this into this, task-based content. And when I say task-based content, I mean content that prescribes one or more pathways for achieving an objective or solving a real-life problem, not a product problem. Not exclusively a product problem, I should say. For example, each of the products that Soda offers, I had written documentation on how to install and configure it. That's not unusual for software, and it certainly follows an established paradigm for software docs: download, install, configure. But as a user, your question with docs is, how do I install and set up Soda Core? Then these docs will be terrific in giving you that answer and helping you achieve that goal. But if you make your way to the documentation as a new user, your question might be more like, I have a problem with missing data in my reports that's messing up my forecasting. How do I get Soda to help me prevent that from happening? You're not going to find a lot of guidance in the docs for that. I wanted to take the procedures and the tasks and the instructions that I already had and just pivot the structure to set these procedures in the context of answering a question, solving a problem, or achieving a goal. So this is my plan. First, I would define a project scope and goal, and I would determine the metrics to gauge success at the end. I would define a new outline or a TOC for the new doc set, and then validate that TOC with trusted other humans. I would map the old TOC to the new TOC, reusing as much content as possible. And after that, it should be easy to fill in the blanks with new material. I would release the content incrementally as I went and as I adjusted the focus on task rather than product. And then finally, after pivoting the focus, repurposing everything, completing the project, I would solicit feedback to gauge project success and refresh the passive metrics that I was collecting to start tracking from a new baseline. So that was the plan. Makes sense, fairly logical. But I will come back to this. In the meantime, how did it turn out? Well, 6 weeks after I started, Soda had a refactored set of documentation. Noticeable right away was the revised main nav. In the subdomain in which the product named headings replaced items. Wait, let me start over. So the revised main nav here eliminated some of the product name headings and replaced them with new items for use case guides and the action word headings for completing tasks that correspond to a first-time user's experience with the products. The subnav for some of these headings also contained refactored and expanded action-based subheadings that aim to offer somewhat progressive guide according to the complexity of things that a user might be experiencing as they started out. Also new were the in-page tabs that offered users a different way of completing a task. So these new choose your own adventure tab path things were aimed to be pretty product agnostic, though I'll be quick to point out that I still needed to add italicized tagging to each subheading to indicate which tool you needed in order to complete the task. I'm not sure I love this way of sort of identifying a prerequisite, but it's kind of a work in progress. The tabular approach here also gives users a glimpse into the varied ways that they can complete a task. Before, these sets of instructions were siloed according to product. So one might never know that you could both schedule a scan and run a scan programmatically. A user may not want to do both, but now they know that it is possible to do so. And at this point, however, you probably have noticed that even though the content is now broken down into tasks, it still seems to describe how to use the products, and not so much how do I prevent missing data from messing up my reports. Too true, there is more. The new use case guides represent the largest tranche of newly written material and arguably one of the best. It was one of the best evolutions here. Each of the use case guides are self-contained in that they offer an end-to-end setup, configuration, and in some cases, integration and fine-tuning for someone who A, has a problem to solve, and B, wonders how SODA might help them solve it. Each title indicates a keyword that ought to resonate with users in different roles within an organization who are seeking to address a problem or trying to get advice on completing a data quality project. I'm perhaps guilty of keyword stuffing here, but if it gets people to the right place, then I guess I'm willing to accept that. For example, the use case that I expanded here targets a data engineer who would use SODA to automatically execute tests for data quality as they export and transform data in a staging environment before they push it into a production environment. It contains sample data, sample snippets, links to example files, install instructions, basically everything you would need to be able to set this up and run it from one page. Complete and self-contained, totally, but not siloed. This material is generous with its learn more links to allow a reader to optionally learn more or stay safely within the little guardrails of this one use case and still get real success and become productive with the products. And this set of guide continues to grow. And finally, we have the refactored content that addresses that cold start problem. I created a get started roadmap for anyone approaching SODA with little to no idea of where to get started or which tools to get started with. The roadmap overview is a new page in the docs, and it includes guidance for choosing the right set of tools for a persona or a use case that someone might be tackling, and kind of a to-do list of chores in order to get from a state of nothing to a state of done. These steps mimic the main nav headings as much as is practical, and each step in the roadmap contains like a signpost section, sort of a rudimentary progress bar, so that can indicate A, where you are in the getting started process, and B, indicates to anyone who might be randomly landing here that this page forms a part of a larger journey through the documentation, and maybe you identify as someone who would like to start at the beginning. So it gives people that trapdoor, I guess you could say, to start over from scratch. My sales engineering colleagues were the most grateful for this content. Rather than extensive hand-holding for new prospects setting things up, they were able to just point to the roadmap and let users set things up, make decisions and set things up themselves at their own pace. It was a money saver right out of the gate. So that was good. That was the outcome of all of the work, but I also I learned some lessons along the way about the project's execution. These lessons seem pretty obvious in hindsight, but I genuinely didn't pick up on them when I was getting started. So starting the things I would do differently, I would decrease the scope. Initially, all the documentation was fair game. I was like, all or nothing, let's do this. But I pretty quickly realized that this was a mistake. I had to pare back the scope to just the instructional content. No reference material like the SODA CL language reference material, no changelog, no release notes. Leave all that aside. Secondly, in trying to build a perfect TOC, to map the old TOC to the new TOC, bad plan. It seemed logical to begin with the end in mind, but in practice, working with trusted colleagues to design the perfect TOC was impossible to get consensus. So, and it ended up being pretty impractical to try to map the old to the new because it was at too much of a macro level and it just wasn't helping. So, don't do that. Thirdly, my instinct to publish refactored content incrementally was a mistake. Working incrementally made the project sound kind of less risky, and it sort of mimicked product development because that's incremental and it sounded familiar. But refactoring is not developing, and it would have been confusing for for someone who was experiencing the change in a disjointed way over time. So I pretty quickly after opening my first and what would turn out to be my only PR, I just went with one big launch of everything. There are a few things, though, that I would recommend doing. First is metrics, to gauge whether readers were better able to get started and answer their questions and solve their problems. My plan was to start capturing some of the passive metrics from before, but I'd also go out into the community to ask existing users what they thought of the docs in a refactored state. And that was ultimately a really good thing to do. Second, after abandoning the... After abandoning the Let's Design a Perfect TOC effort, I just started working on the most difficult and time-consuming part, which was creating the new content to address that cold start problem. Instead of focusing on how to map and reuse content, I had to mentally just kind of set all of that aside for later and focus on what was really going to address the user's needs. That meant, of course, the roadmap to address the where do I start problem, and writing those targeted use case guides was really a lot of work, but time well spent. After writing the new stuff, only after writing the new stuff is when I went in and actually did all of the nitty-gritty detail work of trying to reorganize the main nav in order to reflect the new user's journey a little bit better, and to repurpose the existing content, the existing procedures and instructions and everything else. Third, in terms of project execution, it turns out that I really had to touch every page. I think I'm one slide ahead. Anyway, I really needed to make sure that all of the language on all of the pages referenced the new tasks and not the products. And I needed to responsibly just deal with all of the internal linking and external linking and any redirects that needed to happen. If anyone is interested in SEO and how this affected the SEO, got a whole other talk on that. But for now, it wasn't a bad thing. The details, though, that was exhausting, but it totally needed to be done in order to have a genuinely refactored, complete set of documentation. Oh, and then lastly, we have not a part of the original plan was a marketing style kind of communication of the changes that had happened, why they happened, why the documentation is better, and how to please send me some feedback. So circling back to my original plan and applying what I've learned through the execution of this project, were I to do this again, I would set up a completely different list of tasks here. I would definitely keep the goals and metrics, but I would change the scope and start with the hardest stuff first, squarely addressing meeting the project objective. I would forget about outlining the new TOC and instead refactor the TOC main nav later. And I would offer signposts for those in a non-linear experience through the docs. I would repurpose existing content, reusing as much as was practical. This notably is actually kind of the reverse of what I had originally planned to do. I was going to do the refactoring first and then tackle the new stuff, so this is in fact the reverse. And now of course I realize I had to touch nearly every page in the content, and that I should be publishing everything all at once and not incrementally. I'm still happy with the last step though, to measure success and start tracking metrics from a new baseline. And speaking of success, gauging success, we had some feedback. So after I published all of the docs and refactored the content, the first evidence of success came from some internal feedback. One of our product managers observed that this seemed like an obvious way of doing things. It wasn't bad before, but why weren't we always doing this? And one of our account executives started posting the use cases in LinkedIn and just got a phenomenal response from users. Overall, the changes seemed to be pretty easily digestible, and there weren't any complaints about I can't find anything. It was really still searchable. I actually had deleted very little. So most of it was still there, just pivoted. And from our co-founder, I got some good feedback as well. It landed well with the self-serve stuff for new users. It was definitely a good sign of success. That he picked up on my attempt to progressively disclose information was a bonus. It wasn't an unnatural consequence of reorganizing the content according to task. And this is all good, but what did our users think? Organically, I didn't get much in the way of community feedback beyond a few happy dancy emojis next to the post that I made that said, new documentation now available. I mean, that's fine, I guess. It's like measurable. But after a short spell to allow the changes to really take hold in the community, I went out specifically and reached out to some users in the community via direct message. These were customers. These were people who had used the previous incarnation of the documentation, and as evidenced by their activity in the community, were actively and regularly using the product and the docs. So I asked them 2 questions. Do you find task-based content more useful in solving a problem or answering a question? Would you recommend SOTA documentation to a peer or colleague who uses the software? And overall, the feedback was positive. I didn't actually get much negative feedback at all. The navigation feels more intuitive. The task-based instructions make sense, super helpful, particularly the examples. I'm kind of assuming that they mean the use case guides. They recommend without reservation on a daily basis. So all of this is really good. I'm inclined, even though it's kind of early, I'll call it a success. And finally, the metrics. Again, little thin on metrics, soon to be corrected. It's been about 2 months since I launched these refactored docs. And so the passive metrics, they're a bit thin to draw conclusions. But I will share that of the 32 thumbs up, thumbs down votes on the docs pages since the launch, 75% are helpful. Versus 64% helpful before the launch. So, albeit spanning a greater time frame, it's a data point. And as another single data point, the newest content for the roadmap and the user guides appeared 10 times in the top 25 viewed pages measured from the launch date. So, again, as a single data point, it's not going to tell the whole story, but it is encouraging that all that new content is right up there at the top. I'm going to need to see more overlap between page views and votes and a bunch of other things now that I am smarter, thanks to Renee, to really gauge how it's going. And I'm going to continue to collect feedback from users, particularly and hopefully those during the sales cycle, because those are the new users who are going to be referencing the new material the most. And that's who I really want to interview to find out if Docs is an attractor or a detractor. So it appears that the refactored docs are helping to move the needle for new users. As product development continues for SOTA products, there's going to be potential for more effort on my part to figure out how to take the newly developed feature X and fit it into this new task-based content. So, I mean, I'll have to figure that out as I go. But honestly, figuring out how a feature fits into the documentation is probably a healthy exercise for product and engineering as a whole, because then everyone will have some sort of context and keep in mind exactly how a user is going to use this, or in what part of the journey are they going to use this new feature. And I'm hopeful that more feedback from users ought to dictate how to keep improving the docs as well. This really might not come in the form of complaints about documentation, but rather complaints or challenges about solving problems or answering questions. From a writer's perspective, I'm pretty happy with the outcome. The documentation better fits the mandate of helping users become more productive and confident when using the software, rather than just documenting all the product features. The docs offer help that is more tool and arguably more persona agnostic. The new structure embraces different ways of achieving the same goals or completing a task. And ultimately, I think the documentation is more engaging and approachable. It's more like humans helping humans do a thing. Really, I think that the changes have brought the documentation closer to the user. And that is it.
So the question was, it was an incremental release. It wasn't an incremental release. No, it wasn't getting so it wasn't actually incremental. So it was all at once at the end with that big. Because I remember the slide about the big MR at the end, the killer MR.
That's basically what it amounted to. I started off with the notion of thinking I would do it incrementally, but that was exactly it. It was just going to be too disjointed, too confusing, and just like impossible from my standpoint to try to do bits and pieces at a time because I needed to touch everything. So in the end, yeah, I just went with a whole big, like, this is the date, push the button, out.
Release it all, and was it just you doing it? Was it just you alone? Well, that's good. You don't have to worry about anyone reviewing that merge request, right? 'Cause
I mean,
imagine being faced with that monolith of a merge request to deal with. It's like
with the public repo, anybody could do it, but nobody did.
Yeah. So the question was about internal stakeholder management, which seems to be a challenge at the best of times, right? How was some strategies that you had there to help make that a more streamlined process?
Well, I'll answer the second question first. It was, last count, I had 101 pages, articles of varying size. So for whatever information that gives you, it's not a huge doc set. And I wrote it, so I know it, which is an advantage. Internally, I actually had to cut out a whole bunch of my presentation because it was all about managing internal stakeholders. And initially 2 years ago, when I proposed this, like, hey, you guys, this is an awesome opportunity. We should do this task-based. This is going to be great. It's the future. They were like, absolutely not. In fact, not only are you going to document these by product, you're going to silo them so completely that you're going to write a completely separate set of documentation over here that does not touch this set of documentation over here for this product. And I just did it. I hated it, and I did it, and I kept returning to those stakeholders who were so insistent. This is the way we have to do it. Developers are allergic to UI. It was ridiculous. And then 2 years later, I kept persisting, like, we have an opportunity. Maybe we should change things up. Maybe we should, the products touch each other in real life. We should make that a thing in documentation. So it took basically sort of this cold start problem to really say, like, okay, take a step back. People are really struggling. This is real. What are we going to do to change that? And so that was just like the opportunity to swoop in.
Didn't seem like there was a lot of metrics that would back up the fact that the documentation was failing. You said that the documentation was quite well received, but
it was a failure of the product, of which Docs is a part. So Docs was reinforcing that idea that the products existed separately and independently, and in reality, they did not. So we really needed to address both the product integration issue and the Docs integration.
It was you were doing it for 2 years, and then it was a 6-month execution of the plan, 6-week execution of the plan. So it's not long. Well, it's long leading up to that point, but not long to actually get it done, which is a constant problem we have with docs, is never enough time. So the second point of your question was...
I told you so.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, I told you so. So did you have an opportunity to go, see, look at this, right?
I did. I did. It was 2 years in the making, and so I always had in the back of my mind that, like, eventually there's going to be an opening, and I'm going to take it. And so I wrote a lot of my documentation. Like, the advantage of being the only writer, I knew this was going to happen eventually. And so I wrote very carefully, trying to keep it as task-based as I could, even while buried in these silos, so that when the time came, I could just pull the trigger, which is why it could have probably taken a lot longer, but 6 weeks was like me just sort of setting everything else aside and just drilling on it for 6 weeks. And then I was ready to say, well, I'm not going to tell you I told you so. But it was actually the CEO with the comment there who came up to me at one of the meetups and was like, wouldn't it have been nice if we did this 2 years ago when you said something?
I know, right?
Yeah. Any other questions out there? So the question was for external users. Did you actually have direct contact with those external users about that cold start process? And that was a little bit rough around the edges.
I didn't have direct access. I probably could have because of the connection in the community, but I was mainly operating on feedback from the field. So from our sales engineers primarily, who were out there and we're in touch regularly, often, every day. And so I was getting a lot of information from them about the customer didn't know where to start. They installed the wrong tools to begin with. They don't need all of this. Like, how are we going to make this better? So direct, no. Indirect, yeah.
What did the internal folks think about that? That switch from internal to task, not internal to task, like from that sort of task-based switch. What did they think about it?
I always kept the project open. It's in a public repo. Anybody could see the progress of my work. I was regularly reporting to the team. This is what I've done. This is what I'm doing. This is why. I pretty much got nothing. No one was really, not surprisingly, everyone's busy. It's a small startup. If I had a very specific question, and obviously the use cases, I didn't build all by myself either. So I did have collaborators in it. No one from the technical end of things really did a review. Just kind of like, well, we trust you, off you go. Collaboration, yes. Review, no.
Built there. So, folks, would you just say one more time? Revell.